Hey! This is my breeding ground, shouted the army of Apache women as they raided the Cowboys' ranch. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the dusty plains of the American Southwest. Its orange and gold lights stretched across the open land, casting long shadows that danced over the ranch. The wind carried with it the dry, earthy scent of the desert, mixed with the faint smell of hay from the stables. On this particular day, the small ranch looked peaceful, almost serene. But behind the calm exterior, tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The ranch was owned by Samuel Carter, a man in his late 30s. He had inherited the land from his father, who had built the ranch from scratch. Samuel was a tall, strong man with sun-weathered skin and rough hands from years of working under the harsh desert sun. He loved the land and the cattle he raised, but he also knew that life on the frontier was never easy. Every day brought new challenges, from unpredictable weather to the threat of raids by those who felt the land rightfully belonged to them. Samuel walked along the fence line, checking each post carefully. The wind rattled the wood, making the fence creak. He stopped at a corner where the soil was softer, noticing small hoofprints that weren't from his cattle. He frowned. These tracks were fresh, and their size suggested they belonged to a group of women. Something unusual in this part of the frontier. It wasn't the first time he had heard rumors about Apache women warriors, but he had always dismissed them as stories told around campfires to scare outsiders. Now, seeing the tracks, he could no longer ignore the possibility. Inside the ranch house, life carried on with its usual rhythm. Samuel's wife, Clara, was busy preparing dinner over the open hearth. The aroma of roasted vegetables and fresh bread filled the air. Their children, Emily and Jacob, played quietly in the corner with a handmade wooden horse, oblivious to the worries that clouded their parents' minds. Clara glanced out the window occasionally, her eyes scanning the horizon. She had heard the whispers too, and though she tried not to show it, the idea of an attack made her uneasy. As the family settled into the evening routine, a distant sound drifted across the plains. A faint rustling, almost like the whisper of the wind, but sharper, more deliberate. Samuel froze, listening intently. He had learned to trust his instincts. The desert often whispered secrets if one knew how to hear. He stepped outside, squinting into the growing darkness. The vast land stretched before him, empty and still. Yet he could feel the tension beneath its calm surface. Something was coming. The Apache people had lived on these lands for generations. They knew every curve of the river, every hill, and every hidden trail. Samuel had heard stories from travelers and traders about their bravery and skill in protecting their homes. What many outsiders did not realize, however, was that women were not just passive observers. Many Apache women had learned the ways of hunting, tracking, and even fighting. They carried a strength and resilience that surprised many who underestimated them. A few days before, Samuel had seen smoke rising in the distance. At first he thought it was a small fire, perhaps from a distant homestead, but then he noticed the way it moved, deliberate, as if signaling rather than accidentally rising from a cooking fire. He had brushed it off at the time. But now, seeing the tracks and feeling the subtle shift in the wind, he wondered if it had been a warning. That night, the ranch settled into uneasy quiet. The children slept under heavy blankets, their dreams filled with the soft sounds of the desert. Clara stayed awake longer, her hands busy with sewing, yet her mind was on the horizon. Samuel kept watch outside, leaning against the fence, his eyes scanning the dimly lit plains. Stars began to appear, tiny points of light scattered across the sky, each one a reminder of how small and fragile human life could feel against the vastness of the desert. The following morning brought no relief. Samuel went about his routine, feeding the cattle and repairing a section of the fence that had weakened during a recent windstorm. But his thoughts were elsewhere. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow more pronounced. Even the usual calls of birds and the rustle of leaves in the sparse trees felt different, almost like they were carrying a message. News from nearby settlements had not been encouraging. Travelers spoke in hushed tones about groups of Apache women organizing to defend their land. Some of the accounts were exaggerated, full of fear and imagination, but Samuel could not ignore them completely. He remembered stories from his father about the time Apache warriors, men and women, had defended their villages with unmatched courage. These were people who had survived for centuries in harsh conditions, relying on knowledge, skill, and unity. If a group of women warriors were indeed planning something, the ranch would be at risk. Samuel decided to prepare. He spoke with the neighboring ranchers, and they agreed to keep watch in shifts, ensuring someone was always awake to observe the land. Samuel also inspected his stockpile of supplies, making sure there was enough food, water, and ammunition should the need arise. Though he dreaded the thought of confrontation, he knew that preparation was the only way to survive in these uncertain times. Meanwhile, in the hills beyond the ranch, a group of women gathered. They were skilled, courageous, and determined, and they had their own reasons for action. Their land had been shrinking for years, their resources taken, and their people threatened. These women had learned the ways of the warrior, not out of desire for violence, but out of necessity. They trained in secret, moving silently through the desert, knowing every stone, every brush, every hidden trail. They were mothers, sisters, daughters, yet in their eyes burned the fire of protection for their community and their way of life. As days passed, Samuel and his family noticed more signs: broken branches, scattered rocks, footprints near the water trough. Clara became increasingly anxious, urging Samuel to be cautious and stay alert. Even the children sensed the change, their playful energy tempered by the tension that seemed to hang in the air. Samuel reassured them as best he could, masking his own fear with a calm exterior. He also reflected on the broader picture. The frontier was not simply a place of cowboys and settlers. It was a contested land, home to people who had lived there for centuries. Misunderstandings and conflicts were inevitable. But Samuel hoped for peaceful coexistence. Yet he also knew that sometimes, when survival and justice were at stake, people were forced into actions they might not otherwise choose. In the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Samuel often walked to the top of a small ridge near the ranch. From there he could see the vast expanse of desert, the river that wound through it, and the distant mountains that marked the horizon. He felt both awe and unease. The land was beautiful, but it was also unpredictable, capable of sudden storms, wildfires, and raids. It demanded respect and vigilance. One night as the family gathered for dinner, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows and doors. Samuel paused, sensing something unusual. The children giggled nervously, thinking it was just the wind. But Clara's expression was tense. Rob the brother. The turn signs of an approaching threat, even if she could not name it. Samuel made a silent promise to protect his family and his land, no matter the cost. The first part of the story ends with the ranch bathed in the golden light of a setting sun. The air is thick with anticipation, every sound and movement amplified by the quiet tension. Samuel looks out over his land knowing that life on the frontier is a constant test of courage, resilience, and wisdom. Little did he know that soon the Apache women he had heard about would come closer than ever before, bringing with them a challenge that would test his limits and change his understanding of the land, its people, and the true meaning of bravery. The night had settled over the plains, deep and quiet, with only the faint rustle of the wind through the dry brush to disturb its stillness. The stars hung low and bright in the sky, scattered like tiny diamonds across the black velvet of night. Samuel Carter, the ranch owner, leaned against the fence, his eyes scanning the horizon. He could feel a change in the air, a restless tension that made his skin prickle. He had prepared for weeks, securing his cattle, checking every lock, and even practicing with his rifle. Yet nothing could fully prepare a man for the unknown that approached. Inside the ranch house, Clara moved silently, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered blankets and small provisions. Her children, Emily and Jacob, were asleep, but she could not shake the feeling that tonight would be different. She had heard the stories about Apache women warriors, women who moved like shadows and struck like lightning when defending their people. Clara had dismissed the tales as exaggeration, yet now every sound outside seemed to echo those whispered warnings. Far across the open plains, on a distant ridge, a group of women gathered. Their faces were painted with streaks of clay and ash, blending them into the dark landscape. Each one carried a small bundle of supplies, weapons crafted from the earth itself. Bows and arrows, knives sharpened to perfection, and a few rifles obtained through trade. They moved with a quiet confidence, their eyes sharp and alert, scanning the land below. They were not seeking unnecessary conflict, but they had a purpose: to protect their families, their territory, and their way of life. Among them was Ayuk, a young but experienced leader. She had learned the ways of her people from her mother and grandmother, skills that included tracking, hunting, and combat. Her voice was calm but firm, carrying authority over the group. "Tonight," she whispered, "we remind them that this land belongs to us, not by words, but by presence. Let them see that we are not to be ignored or underestimated." As the women descended from the ridge, the night seemed to hold its breath. They moved like shadows across the open terrain, stepping carefully over rocks and brush. Their movements were silent, almost imperceptible, and they knew the land intimately. Every path, every dip in the soil, every clump of grass was familiar to them, giving them a distinct advantage over the outsiders who had come to settle and claim what was never truly theirs. Back at the ranch, Samuel's unease grew. He had stationed a few trusted men around the perimeter, but the wind carried whispers too faint to discern, and the darkness seemed thicker than usual. Every rustle of a branch or shift in the sand made him tense his muscles and raise his rifle. Clara watched from the window, holding her breath each time a shadow passed. She did not want to alert the children, but she could not hide the worry in her eyes. Then, without warning, the attack began. A sharp whistle cut through the night, and arrows hissed past the fence posts. One struck a wooden post with a sharp thunk, vibrating through the ground. Samuel reacted instinctively, shouting commands to his men. They grabbed their rifles and tried to organize, but the attackers were fast, coordinated, and unseen. The first wave of arrows was meant to scare and distract rather than harm, and Samuel realized this quickly. The women knew the men's habits and were using fear to unbalance them. Clara grabbed a blanket and held it over her children, pulling them close. She whispered reassurances, though her voice trembled. Emily and Jacob clutched each other, wide-eyed, sensing the seriousness of the moment. The sounds outside, the whistling arrows, the crashing of boots on dry earth, the occasional shout, made the house feel both enormous and vulnerable at the same time. Ahyuk led the group with careful precision. They split into smaller teams, some moving toward the cattle pens, others circling the house. Their goal was not destruction, but control and demonstration. They wanted Samuel and his men to understand that this was no ordinary raid. It was a statement. They moved quickly, leaving signs of their presence, arrows placed upright in the soil, footprints arranged in deliberate patterns, and small bundles of sage burned at key points as a mark of respect and warning. The cowboys fired back sporadically, but they were disorganized. They had expected a conventional attack, perhaps a single group of raiders, but this was different. The Apache women struck from multiple directions, taking advantage of the darkness and their deep knowledge of the terrain. Samuel realized that brute force alone would not win this battle. Strategy, awareness, and understanding of their tactics were crucial. Despite the danger, there was no cruelty in the women's actions. They avoided direct harm to the children and Clara, focusing instead on demonstrating control over the ranch's spaces. They aimed arrows near the water troughs, rattled the gates, and made noise to unsettle the men. Samuel watched from a safe distance, heart pounding, as his animals stampeded in confusion. Yet he also began to notice the careful restraint in the attackers' movements, a discipline that spoke volumes about their intentions. Hayo called her team together briefly, signaling silently with hand gestures. One of the women moved to the edge of the ranch house, placing a bundle of feathers and small stones outside the door. A symbol she knew that this land was watched and protected. The message was clear. The ranch could survive, but only if respect was given to those who had lived on the land for generations. Inside, Samuel made quick decisions. He ordered his men to retreat to the house, to secure the doors and to minimize risk. He realized that the attack was not about conquering his home, but about sending a message. In that moment, his fear mixed with a reluctant respect. These were not mindless attackers. They were skilled, intelligent, and purposeful. The night continued with intermittent movements. The women would strike silently, then retreat, leaving the cowboys scrambling to respond. At one point, Samuel saw a shadow near the cattle pens. He raised his rifle, but before he could fire, an arrow landed with a soft thunk into the ground near his feet. A warning, not a threat. Ahiok and her group were close, but careful, testing the limits of their adversaries. Hours seemed to stretch, like days. Samuel's body ached from tension, his eyes burning from fatigue, but he remained vigilant. He noticed patterns. The women never stayed in one place too long. They communicated with subtle signs, and they always maintained a strategic advantage. Clara, though frightened, began to recognize a strange rhythm to the attack. It was like a dance, an orchestrated series of movements designed to challenge, not to destroy. By dawn, the raid began to lose momentum. The first light of morning painted the plains in soft pinks and oranges, revealing the landscape in stark detail. The women had achieved their goal. They had demonstrated skill, courage, and control. They had shown that the land was theirs to protect, and that those who settled there would need to act with respect. One by one, they retreated, melting back into the hills as silently as they had come. Samuel and his men surveyed the ranch. The damage was minor. Some broken fences, scattered hay, and startled cattle, but the message had been clear and powerful. Clara stepped outside, clutching the children, and looked toward the hills. "They are strong," she said softly, more in awe than fear. Samuel nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and newfound understanding. These women were defenders of their people, not mere raiders. Their courage and skill had left a mark, both on the land and on the minds of those who had lived on it. The family and the ranch hands worked through the morning, repairing fences and calming the cattle. Samuel took time to examine the subtle signs the women had left. The footprints, the small symbols, the careful placement of objects. He realized that this was not just a battle of force, but a lesson in awareness, respect, and understanding of the land and its original guardians. Ahayok and her team had returned to their own territory, but their presence lingered like a shadow over the plains. They had achieved more than a physical victory. They had made an impression of strength, intelligence, and determination that would be remembered by the settlers. Their raid was not an act of vengeance, but an assertion of identity and protection of their people. By the end of the day, Samuel felt the weight of the encounter settle in his mind. He had survived, but he had also been taught a lesson he could not ignore. Life on the frontier was not simply about owning land, it was about understanding, respect, and coexistence. The Apache women had reminded him of that, and their courage would remain a lesson he carried for the rest of his days. The events of that night would be retold many times, both by the settlers and by the Apache people. It was a story of tension, strategy, and respect, showing that bravery and intelligence were not limited to men or any single group. It was a reminder that the land belonged to many, and that understanding and careful action were often more powerful than force alone. The morning sun rose slowly over the plains, painting the land with a gentle, golden light. The air smelled of dust, fresh grass, and the faint scent of smoke from the previous night. Samuel Carter stood at the edge of the ranch, his eyes scanning the horizon. The world seemed calm again, yet he could feel that something had changed. The raid was over, but its impact lingered like an invisible weight pressing on the land and on the minds of everyone at the ranch. Inside the ranch house, Clara moved quietly, tidying up and tending to the children. Emily and Jacob had woken early, their eyes wide with curiosity and unease. They asked questions, their voices small and cautious. "Why did they come, Mama?" Emily whispered. Clara knelt beside her daughter, brushing her hair back gently. "Because they wanted to protect their home," she said softly. "Just like we protect ours." She could feel the truth of her words, even as she struggled to make them simple for the children to understand. Samuel joined her in the kitchen, his expression serious but calm. He had spent the night walking the perimeter, checking the fences, the barns, and the cattle pens. Most of the damage had been minor. Broken fences, scattered feed, and a few startled animals. But the emotional impact was far greater. Samuel realized that his life on the frontier was more fragile than he had ever imagined. The raid had been a warning, a lesson in awareness, respect, and humility. He gathered the ranch hands for a meeting in the barn. Their faces were tense, still reflecting the fear and adrenaline from the night before. Samuel spoke in a steady voice, recounting what he had observed. "They were skilled, careful, and disciplined," he said. "They did not come to destroy, but to make themselves known. We must remember this." The men listened quietly, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uneasily. They had faced danger before, but nothing like this. Nothing that combined strategy, intelligence, and courage in such a controlled way. As the morning progressed, Samuel took the time to examine the subtle signs the women had left: the soft soil, small bundles of stones and feathers, marks on the fence posts, each one carefully placed, each one intentional. He realized that this was a message, not just an attack. The Apache women had wanted him to understand something deeper, that the land had guardians, and that strength and courage came in many forms. Clara helped calm the children as they wandered outside, showing them the animals and the repaired fences. She spoke gently about the bravery she had seen, about the importance of understanding others and respecting the land.
Emily listened closely, her young mind absorbing the lessons like a sponge.
Jacob, more restless, asked a dozen questions about the women and their skills. Clara answered as best she could, emphasizing care, respect, and the courage to protect what mattered most. Meanwhile, Samuel walked to the top of a small ridge near the ranch, the same ridge from which he had first watched the approaching shadows. From here, he could see the vast expanse of the desert, the river winding slowly across the plains, and the distant mountains that marked the edge of the horizon. The view was beautiful, but it reminded him of the fragility of life in this harsh land. He thought of the Apache women and their families, the reasons that had led them to take action, and the balance between survival and respect that governed life here. As the days passed, the ranch began to return to its usual rhythm. The cattle were herded, fences repaired, and daily chores resumed. Yet the memory of the raid remained vivid. Samuel found himself reflecting on what had happened, considering the lessons it had offered. He began to understand that the frontier was not simply a place of cowboys, settlers, and conflict. It was a shared space, a land with histories, families, and traditions that demanded recognition. Bad desperado. He decided to record his thoughts in a journal, a habit his father had encouraged him to maintain. He wrote about the raid, the skill and courage of the women, and the messages left behind. He described the land in detail, the animals, the sky, and the wind. But he also wrote about the feelings it stirred in him: fear, respect, humility, and a growing awareness of how little he truly understood about the people who had lived on this land long before his family arrived. Clara joined him one evening as he wrote, watching the sun dip behind the hills. "You're changing, Sam," she said softly. "You're seeing things differently."
He looked up, tired but thoughtful. "I have to," he replied.
If we are to live here, we must learn to see beyond our own needs. There is courage and wisdom in those women. Wisdom we ignored until last night. Clara nodded, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. The moment was quiet but profound, a shared recognition of the deeper truths of frontier life. In the days that followed, Samuel made small but meaningful changes. He began to notice the land more carefully, the way the river shifted after a storm, the tracks of animals in the soil, the signs of approaching weather. He taught his children to observe, to ask questions, and to respect the rhythms of nature. He spoke to his ranch hands about the importance of understanding others, of seeing strength in unexpected places, and of valuing life over conquest. The local community also felt the effects of the raid. Stories spread quickly, first among the settlers and then beyond. People spoke in hushed tones of the bravery of the Apache women, of their strategic skill, and of the respect they commanded. Some were fearful, but many were inspired, recognizing that courage and intelligence could come in forms they had never expected. Samuel, too, shared his observations, emphasizing the need for understanding rather than fear, respect rather than retaliation. Meanwhile, in the hills beyond the ranch, Ayuk and her group returned to their territory. They moved quietly, as always, but their hearts were light. They had achieved their goal, not destruction, but assertion of their presence and protection of their land. Their families were safe, and their community was reminded that their strength was real, visible, and respected. Ahayok felt a sense of pride, tempered by the knowledge that the frontier was a complicated place, and that every action carried consequences. As weeks turned into months, Samuel found that his fear had slowly transformed into respect. He had learned that the world was bigger than his ranch, that life was more complex than he had imagined, and that courage could appear in unexpected forms. He continued to document his thoughts, recording stories, observations, and reflections, hoping that future generations would learn not just from success, but from understanding and respect for others. Clara and the children adapted as well. Emily showed a keen interest in tracking and observing the land, asking questions about the people and animals who lived nearby. Jacob became more thoughtful, learning to notice patterns and signs in the world around him. The raid, once a source of fear, had become a lesson in resilience, observation, and empathy. The memory of the Apache women remained vivid. Samuel often thought of Hayok's calm, determined eyes and the careful movements of the group as they moved through the night. He reflected on their courage not as enemies, but as people protecting what mattered most. He realized that the frontier was not simply a battleground, it was a place where understanding, respect, and shared humanity mattered as much as skill and strength. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Samuel walked with his family across the ranch. They paused at the edge of the fields, looking toward the distant hills. "Do you think they are still watching?" Emily asked quietly. Samuel smiled gently. "Perhaps," he said. "But not out of anger. Out of care, and to remind us to respect this land and each other." Clara squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of their shared understanding. The moment was peaceful, yet it carried the echoes of lessons learned and wisdom gained. By the end of the season, the ranch had recovered physically, but the hearts and minds of its residents had changed. Samuel, Clara, and the children had gained a deeper understanding of the land, the people who had lived on it, and the importance of observation, respect, and courage. The raid had been a challenge, yes, but it had also been a teacher. And in the quiet moments of reflection, Samuel understood that life on the frontier was not just about surviving. It was about learning, growing, and seeing the world through the eyes of others. The story of that night continued to live in their minds, shaping their actions and attitudes. Mabers and eventually his children, ensuring that the lessons of courage, strategy, and respect were not forgotten. The Apache women, too, continued their lives, carrying with them the knowledge that their actions had been seen, respected, and understood, even by those who once regarded them as outsiders. In this way, the aftermath of the raid became more than an event. It became a bridge between two worlds. One side had learned respect and awareness. The other had asserted strength and protection. Both had changed, and both would carry the memory forward, a reminder that courage, intelligence, and humanity were never limited to one side or one group.
Life on the frontier continued, as it always did, with its challenges and rhythms.
But the echoes of that night, the careful strategy of the women, and the reflections of Samuel and his family would linger, guiding their actions, shaping their perspectives, and teaching them that the greatest victories were often those of understanding, empathy, and respect. Years passed and the desert plains remained as vast and unyielding as ever. The sun still rose and set with the same golden brilliance, the wind still whispered through the dry grasses, and the river wound slowly across the land. Yet beneath the timeless surface, much had changed for the people who lived on these lands. Samuel Carter's ranch had endured the years, growing stronger in some ways and wiser in others. The memory of the Apache women's raid was no longer a source of fear, but a story of courage, strategy, and understanding that shaped the lives of those who had witnessed it. Samuel had grown older, his hair streaked with gray, but his hands remained strong from years of labor. The ranch had expanded, and he had learned to live with the land rather than simply claim it. He often walked the fences, checking cattle and fields, but he also took time to observe the small details, the tracks of wild animals, the patterns of the clouds, and the subtle signs that weather was changing. He had learned to listen to the land, to read it as if it were a living, breathing teacher. Clara continued to manage the household with quiet strength and grace. She had guided her children, Emily and Jacob, through years of lessons learned not only from their family but from the broader world around them. She had encouraged their curiosity and taught them the importance of respect, courage, and intelligence, all lessons inspired by the events that had unfolded so many years before. The children had grown, carrying with them the values of observation, empathy, and careful thought, knowing that every choice had consequences beyond their immediate understanding. Samuel often thought of Ayok, the young Apache woman who had led the raid. He did not know where she was now, or if she still led her people, but the lessons she and her companions had imparted lingered in his mind. The careful strategy, the intelligence, the courage, all of it had changed how he viewed life on the frontier. He realized that strength was not measured solely by force or numbers, but by wisdom, preparation, and the ability to protect one's people while minimizing unnecessary harm. Over the years, Samuel began sharing the story of that night with neighbors, travelers, and visitors to the ranch. He told it not as a tale of fear or conflict, but as a story of bravery, planning, and respect. It was not just an attack, he would say. It was a lesson. Perhaps courage and wisdom come in many forms, and we must recognize it wherever it appears. His listeners were often struck by the clarity of his reflections. Some were skeptical at first, expecting stories of victory or conquest. But Samuel emphasized something deeper: understanding others, respecting their connection to the land, and valuing intelligence and restraint over force. Emily and Jacob, now teenagers, often helped their father with daily work on the ranch, yet they also spent time learning about the people who had lived on the land for generations. Samuel encouraged them to learn from the histories and traditions of others, not simply to dismiss or fear what was different. Emily especially showed a keen interest in tracking and observation, wanting to understand the patterns of both animals and people. Jacob, thoughtful and analytical, often questioned why people acted the way they did, seeking to understand the motivations behind every decision. Both carried the lessons of that night, passing them along to friends and neighbors, ensuring that the story would endure beyond their immediate family. In the nearby hills, the Apache community continued to live with the rhythms of the land. tending their families and traditions with care. Ahayak's leadership remained a symbol of wisdom and courage, though few outside her community knew her name. Within her people, however, she was respected not only as a warrior but as a protector, someone who had acted not out of anger but out of responsibility and care for her community. Her story, like Samuel's, became part of the oral history, a reminder that bravery and strategy were not limited to men or conventional roles, and that protection of one's people often required both intelligence and restraint. As time passed, the landscape itself seemed to absorb the memory of those events. Certain hills, trails, and river bends became markers of stories shared between families. The footprints, marks, and symbols left during the raid were long gone, but the lessons they represented remained. Samuel and Clara often pointed these places out to their children, telling them about the balance between courage and respect, about seeing strength where it might not be obvious, and about the importance of humility in the face of wisdom. Occasionally, travelers or new settlers would arrive at the ranch, unaware of the history of the land. Samuel would take the opportunity to share the story, describing the careful strategy of the Apache women, the courage they displayed, and the lessons that could be drawn from it. People listened with a mixture of awe and reflection, recognizing that the frontier was more than open land and cattle. It was a space of shared history, resilience, and human connection. In these years, Samuel also took steps to ensure that his family lived in harmony with the land. He began planting trees and shrubs along water sources, learning from the patterns of native plants and animals. Audacious. He encouraged sustainable practices and made sure that the ranch's activities caused minimal disruption to the ecosystem. This shift was not only practical but symbolic, a recognition that respect for life, land, and people was intertwined, and that survival and success depended on balance rather than domination. Clara and Samuel also reflected on the ways in which the raid had strengthened their family. They had faced fear together, navigated danger, and learned to trust not only their instincts, but also the intelligence and strategy of others. Their children absorbed these lessons naturally, learning that life was not simply about winning or losing, but about understanding, adapting, and growing stronger through awareness and respect. Years later, when Emily was old enough to travel on her own, Samuel spoke with her about Atchioke and her companions. "Remember," he said, "courage and wisdom are not always visible. Sometimes the strongest people act quietly, with care and intelligence, protecting what they love without needing praise. That is what true strength looks like." Emily nodded, her eyes reflecting both admiration and understanding. She carried this knowledge with her as she began her own journey into the wider world, using it to guide her decisions, interactions, and relationships. Jacob, too, reflected on the events in his own way. He often observed the land meticulously, noting patterns, learning from nature, and seeking to understand the motivations of people around him. He wrote in journals, like his father, recording insights, observations, and reflections that would one day serve as lessons for future generations. The memory of the raid, while not frightening anymore, remained a cornerstone of his understanding of strategy, respect, and courage. Samuel and Clara also encouraged their neighbors to view the land and its history with respect. They spoke at local gatherings, sharing stories of the Apache women and the lessons learned from the frontier. Some listeners were initially skeptical, expecting tales of conquest or revenge, but Samuel emphasized the importance of seeing beyond conflict, recognizing courage and intelligence wherever it appeared, and learning from others rather than judging or dismissing them. Over time, their community began to adopt these ideas, fostering a culture of awareness, respect, and careful observation that enriched everyone's lives. As the years continued, the story of the raid became legend in the area. It was told around campfires, passed down from one generation to the next, and eventually became part of the recorded history of the region. But even as the story spread, its true essence remained intact. A tale not of violence or vengeance, but of courage, intelligence, and respect. It was a reminder that bravery came in many forms, that wisdom often outweighed force, and that the greatest victories were those of understanding and empathy.
By the time Samuel grew older and passed on the ranch to Emily and Jacob, the land had become more than a property.
It was a living record of lessons learned, a place where history, memory, and human connection intertwined.
The cattle and crops thrived, yes, but so did the values of observation, respect, and courage.
Every hill, every fence, every river bend carried stories of strategy, bravery, and the enduring lessons of the Apache women who had once come to remind the settlers of the importance of awareness and respect. Emily and Jacob, now adults, carried forward the legacy. They taught their own children about the land, about courage and intelligence, and about the importance of understanding those around them. They spoke of Ahiok and her companions, not as enemies, but as teachers, and of their father's reflections and guidance. The lessons endured, shaping new generations, ensuring that the story remained alive and meaningful. In the quiet moments of reflection, Samuel, Clara, Emily, and Jacob often looked toward the distant hills. They imagined the women watching, proud of what they had accomplished, not through violence, but through strategy, care, and courage. The land itself seemed to acknowledge these lessons, holding memory in every stone, tree, and river bend. And as the sun rose and set over the plains, the people of the ranch understood something profound. Life on the frontier was not just about survival, but about awareness, empathy, courage, and respect, the qualities that truly defined strength. In this way, the story of the raid became more than a moment in time. It became a lasting lesson, a bridge between two worlds, and a reminder that the choices people make, the care they show, and the wisdom they apply can leave a legacy far greater than fear or force ever could. The Apache women's courage, Samuel's reflections, Clara's guidance, and the children's learning all intertwined into a single story, one of humanity, understanding, and the enduring power of respect.